Finance Committee for May 25th, 2010 to order. Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Interim Finance Director. And we have a full agenda. And what I propose is we just kind of go in order with the items that's listed, starting first with the restated and amended cooperation agreement with the City of Housing Authority. And we have Mr. Stephen Falstich to discuss that item.
I'm Stephen Falstich, the Housing and Housing Programs Supervisor for the City, and this item concerns the offer of the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Barbara to collect certain operating subsidies known as Payment in Lieu of Taxes, or a nice acronym, PILOT, and transfer those payments to the city's general fund. It's estimated that these pilot payments will total about $57,000 to the city in the coming fiscal year 2010-2011. And the Housing Authority, just by way of background, does not pay any taxes on its properties under state law and the federal requirements. They don't pay any taxes to the city or to the county, and that's required by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. So the city can't impose any taxes, but has to provide services to the projects without receipt of any mandatory requirement for funds. Now, in 1969, the city entered into a cooperation agreement with the Housing Authority in which the city agreed to provide all of these services to these HUD-funded projects at no charge, no cost. This cooperation agreement was required by HUD as a condition of the funding. However, in order to help cities recoup some of the costs of providing services such as police and fire to protection to the HUD-funded projects, state law allows housing authorities to make voluntary payments of pilot. In the early years, it was standard practice for the housing authority to make these payments to the city every year. However, in 1986, the housing authority was suffering some financial difficulties and approached the city, and the city agreed to stop receiving pilot payments, and the city has received no pilot payments since 1986. But the Housing Authority has recently informed the city that it is again in the position to make payments of pilot funds. In order to begin making payments, however, the Housing Authority and the city have requested some minor revisions to the cooperation agreement to conform the agreement to state law. So the recommendation before you is that the Finance Committee consider and recommend to Council that the Council hold a noticed public hearing and adopt a resolution as required by state law approving an amended and restated cooperation agreement between the Housing Authority and the City in order to accept pilot funds. And there really aren't a lot of other conditions on the receipt of these funds. It would go to the city's general fund. Rob Pearson, the Executive Director of the Housing Authority, is here to answer any questions, and so that's my presentation.
Questions from committee members? I have one question. Obviously this year it makes sense to have this be going into the general fund. As a long run, in the long run, I wonder if it would not be better for these funds, because they are not encumbered by HUD conditions or other things, to go into our basically our funding for creating middle income housing, which we don't have very much funding of at all, because we cannot we do not have access to the same kinds of funds. So I think receipt into our general fund, while things are tough, makes perfect sense. But in outgoing years, I would at least would like to have the discussion about having that go into our middle income housing needs for the community. Sure, Rob. Rob, you got to get up to the mic.
I appreciate that comment. I think that was the thinking of the council.
Rob Pearson,
Rob Pearson, Executive Director of the Housing Authority. I think in 1986 that was the thinking of the council then, that
they wanted to alleviate any additional expense to the Housing Authority and let it use its money to build more housing. This particular change, and what I talked to Mr. Armstrong about, is because of some accounting changes at HUD, they have now, we are now eligible for operating subsidy where we can collect this pilot and actually pass it on to the city. And the way the agreement is structured, it's my belief, in talking to our attorney, it does need to go for general fund type services. And that would be my recommendation. I think what the council may want to do, consider in years where the general fund is really healthy, is that you could appropriate money for housing out of your general fund. I don't think that's beyond, and that would get to, I think, what Councilman Williams is talking about. But I think right now we want to collect this from HUD and pay it to the general fund, and then let your good minds decide how best it be expended in the future. But I do appreciate that comment.
Thank you, Rob. Is there a recommendation from the committee?
Actually, one more question. Mr. Pearson, Mr. Falstich mentioned that there are some changes in this new version of the pilot funds compared to what the city had before, and I don't know anything about what the city arrangements were before, but is it anything substantive?
No, the city made it permissive. If we had the funding and we wanted to make the payments, we would do it. And now with us qualifying for operating subsidy, we tried to stay out of HUD's operating subsidy program for a long time because we've in some ways, it's a recipe to mismanage, in my personal opinion. If your expenses exceed your revenue, HUD comes in and makes you whole. And the program has been underfunded at the federal level, so we've stayed away from it. But because of certain accounting procedures, they've forced us into operating subsidy. So we figured we might as well take it. And one of the biggest elements for us for operating subsidy is this pilot. So that is the major change. Just one other comment on background is, like any public-owned piece of property, it's exempt from property tax. So that happens in all of our non-HUD stock. This really only applies to the federally funded public housing. Even a private developer building affordable rental housing today, if the rents are restricted and there are low-income people in there, they apply for a welfare exemption. So there are no property taxes on affordable housing in California that is rental housing in nature. They're structured so that these projects normally can't carry a property tax bill as an additional liability. So this is one area where we got the feds willing to pay some of it, so why shouldn't we, in these tough times, get that money and pass it on to your general fund?
Okay. Thank you.
Can we get a staff recommendation? Or a motion?
The staff recommendation is that Finance Committee consider and recommend to Council that Council hold a public hearing and adopt, by reading of title only, a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara approving the restated and amended cooperation agreement between the City and the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Barbara concerning the Housing Authority's payment to the City's general fund of payment in lieu of taxes from certain Housing Authority rental projects, and authorizing the mayor to execute such agreement.
Is there a motion?
I move the recommendation as read.
Is there a second?
I second.
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None? Motion carries. Mr. Samario.
Okay, thank you. The next item is the RDA interims, and as you know, we do bring these before the Finance Committee every month, or actually on a quarterly basis. It's really just to respond to any questions. We don't have planned presentations with respect to the RDA's status as of March 31st, but again, willing to answer questions, and Rudy and Brian are available for that.
Any questions on the RDA interims?
Not from me.
No.
Okay. Ryan, you get off easy.
Okay, so with that, then we'll turn over to the city's third quarter review, and we do have a presentation on that, and we'll spend about 10 minutes or so, and Mr. Rudy Livingston, our county manager, will make that report.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the Finance Committee. My name is Rudy Livingston. I'm the accounting manager for the city, and we're here to present the third quarter results of operations for the 9 months ended March 31st, 2010. The table that you see there includes all the general fund budget and revenue to date, revenues through March 31st, 2010. And for purposes of this analysis that we do, we compare the actual we compare the actual revenues to a 3-year average collection rate for those type of revenues on the tax side of things, because those are seasonal in nature and they don't come in exactly at the same 1/12 each month. So we believe that we get a little bit better comparison when we do that year-to-date average. On all the other revenues, we actually look at them and compare them to 75% of the total budget for the year. And so that's what you're seeing up there. When you see the variances, it's in that line. And I just want to reflect on touch on a couple of these things here. Through March 31st, the city has received approximately 66.7% of overall budgeted general fund revenues. And this is $3.4 million below the year-to-date budget amount. Now, this variance includes $1.4 million in mutual aid revenue that are mostly offset by mutual aid overtime savings. And it also includes a $1.3 million variance in budgeted year-end, this budgeted year-end variance line that we put down at the bottom. This is an estimate of the total positive variance in budgeted revenues and expenditures through the year. So we include it in the revenue section here, but it really is where we're expecting to end up on a net positive variance between the revenues and the expenditures throughout the year. So it's there. It doesn't have any actual because it's a number that we compare to the final year-end results. Staff has spent a lot of time updating council on the revenues in recent meetings of the Finance Committee and throughout the budget process, and analysis was included in the agenda report, so I was not planning to discuss revenues further unless there are any questions specifically.
Please continue. We'll
Okay.
take questions at the end.
Okay. We'll move to the general fund expenditures now. The table that you'll see there includes, it summarizes the general fund budget and year-to-date expenditures through March 31st, 2010. The annual budget column represents the amended budget, which includes appropriation carryovers from the prior year as well as any supplemental appropriations approved by council in the current year. The year-to-date budget column represents 75% of the annual budget. And this coincides with the 9 out of 12 months of the fiscal year elapsed at this point in time. And also, we do this because most of the expenditures tend to be incurred fairly evenly throughout the year because of the high percentage of our budget that is in salaries and benefits. And they account for approximately 75% of total general fund expenditures. Having said that, though, there is one thing that kind of skews the results at March 31st because we pay every other week. We don't have two payrolls that actually occur in each and every month, and so there's a slight timing difference at the end of March 31st, and this will be made up in the fourth quarter when we actually end up with one extra pay period. So there's about a 1.8% inherent variance because of that timing of the payroll. The total amended budget totals approximately $103.4 million, with the year-to-date budget calculated at $77.5 million. Actual expenditures of $72.4 million, combined with $668,000 in encumbrances, result in an overall favorable general fund variance of $4.5 million at March 31st, and that's the next to the last column on the right there. Now, of this total variance, approximately $3.3 million is related to salaries and benefits. And part of that, is $1.5 million of that is that timing that I just mentioned. But there's also some additional salary and benefit savings that we've recognized because of the hiring freeze that's been in effect for most of the year. And we've kept vacant positions open and really made a conscientious effort to try and save where we can to offset the negative revenue picture that we have at this time. Now, the interesting thing is there is the remaining $1.8 million of the salary and benefit savings. That's in addition to the $817,000 of furlough savings that was included in the budget. So that is actual savings in salaries and benefits above and beyond the furlough money. All departments are within the year-to-date budget at March 31st, and I'm only going to discuss 3 departmental variances that we have on that schedule there. The first one is the Finance Department. We'll see that the Finance Department expenditures and encumbrances were approximately $45,000 under the year-to-date budget at March 31st. And if things were staying the same as they've been going along, we anticipate that it would be right along that line. However, we have proposed a couple of adjustments, requests for additional appropriations in the Finance Department, and I'd just like to briefly talk about that. We've proposed a $75,000 increase in appropriations for professional services. These increased appropriations will be for some audit programs for the UUT and also the cable franchising agreements. And we propose that we will cover the cost of these additional appropriations with fees from our utility late payments that we've received in excess of what we had budgeted this year. The Police Department expenditures and encumbrances were 3.4% under the year-to-date budget, and this is primarily due to position vacancies. While it's a fairly large number, it is only 3.4%. Having spoken with the management over in the Police Department, they are anticipating that their year-end total is going to be very close to what was budgeted. However, at this point in time, they believe that they will be able to make it through the year without any need for supplemental appropriations. And if they determine that those are needed, we will bring those to council as soon as we are aware of them, and we'll discuss that with you at that time. The last one that I want to discuss is the Fire Department expenditures, which are approximately $1.1 million under the year-to-date budget. This variance is almost entirely due to salary and benefit savings related to mutual aid responses. As we've discussed many times before, when our firefighters are called out to fight fires in other jurisdictions outside of Santa Barbara County, we receive mutual aid revenues, and that's the large negative variance in the revenue side of $1.4 million because our firefighters haven't had many responses this year. And the offset to that is approximately $1.1 million in salary and benefit savings that are related to the fire that were built in that appear that they will not be spent this year. So there's an offsetting number there. This concludes my report on the general fund expenditures, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have before we move to the enterprise fund revenues and expenses. Excuse me. The table that you see in front of you there on the screen summarizes the enterprise fund revenues and expenses through March 31st, and it also has a comparison to budget and the prior year numbers. The year-to-date budget for revenues in the enterprise funds is calculated based upon a 3-year average collection rate through March 31st of each year. And the reason for this is most of the enterprise fund revenues are affected by seasonal operations. For instance, we know that in the warm summer and fall months that there's going to be a little bit more water usage than there will be in the rainy winter months and things of that nature. And we try to factor those in so that we can get a good comparison of where we are from year to year and where we think we ought to be. The year-to-date budget for expenditures is strictly straight line at 75% of the total elapsed time in the year. Now, unlike general fund revenues, which rely primarily on taxes to subsidize programs and services, enterprise fund operations are primarily financed from user fees. And accordingly, the enterprise fund revenues have not been negatively impacted by the steep decline that we've seen in key tax revenues this year. However, the recession has taken its toll on many of the important enterprise fund revenues. The good thing is that some of these were considered when the budgets were being prepared, and so we aren't seeing huge fluctuations in most of those and negative revenue variances at this time. Expenses in each of the enterprise funds are below the year-to-date budget at March 31st, and they are making a conscientious effort to bring in savings in expenses to offset any negative revenue experience they will have. I'm only going to discuss a couple of the key variances in these enterprise funds. right now. All of the other revenues and expenses of the enterprise funds are within expected parameters. You'll see from the schedule that on the first line there that water fund revenues were $746,000 ahead of the year-to-date budget, and this is about 2.1% ahead of the three-year average. Metered water sales account for approximately 97% of the revenues in the water fund. And those revenues were actually only about 71% of the annual budget because of the heavy winter rains that resulted in the revenues falling below this 74% normal range. So the question would be, well, why, if the metered water sales are down, why are we having a positive revenue variance? And it's explained by one thing. Over the last couple of years, we had some significant fire damage in the hills, and the silt has come down and gone into our reservoirs. And it has increased our filtration costs significantly in the water operation. We have two other partners in the Cater treatment plant that help to offset. They pay their portion of running the expenses of the Cater plant. And with these increased expenses, their contribution to running the plant has increased significantly. And so the positive variance that we're seeing here is related to the payments that we've received from those two partners reimbursing us for the additional costs. Revenues are expected to meet budget for the year in the water fund overall. Golf fund revenues were $248,000 below the year-to-date budget at March 31st, and this is attributable to a couple of significant factors. First of all, we know that with the economic downturn in the economy, the number of rounds played went down a fair amount. And so that's led to reduced revenues. But also, we had portions of the course were closed due to some significant projects that we were doing out there for the master improvement plan and some creeks or water projects out there at the golf course. Those have been completed, and now they're seeing that the rounds of golf are starting to pick up. However, they still are projecting that the golf fund will end the year approximately $400,000 below the budgeted revenues. Golf fund expenses and encumbrances were approximately $94,000 under the year-to-date budget at March 31st. But staff is anticipating that expense reductions will offset a significant portion of the revenue shortfall, and management projections indicate that they will have approximately $346,000 of expense reductions by year end. It won't offset the entire negative revenue variance, but they're anticipating that they will be able to cover most of that. And you'll be getting further updates with that when we come back to you in a couple of months. And with that, I would like to conclude my report on the enterprise funds, and if there are no questions, I'll move forward to the proposed third quarter adjustments.
Is there any questions on general fund revenues, expenses, or the enterprise fund revenues, expenses?
I have one question.
Councilmember Self.
The airport fund, I imagine that is because it is down because of the ongoing project at the airport?
Yeah, if we look at if you look, that's a good question, Councilmember Self. If you look at the airport fund revenues, they're actually tracking slightly ahead of the 3-year average. And the reason for that is there are a few properties that have been vacant and now they've been leased out. There are some changes in the commercial airline revenues where the fleets that people such as the air service, the freight service, their fleet structure has changed, and so landing fees are up a fair amount out there, and they're anticipating that they are going to meet the revenue budget for the year. And the expenses in here, they're cutting back wherever they can, and the capital portion of the terminal and such things are actually accounted for in a separate fund too, so that doesn't skew these numbers in the operating fund.
Thank you.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Rudy, in the downtown parking fund,
Yes.
what's the reason behind the variance there in expenses?
The largest variance in the expenses in the downtown parking fund really relates to salary and benefit savings and some costs, maintenance costs that have been deferred slightly. Looking at the revenues, we know that revenues are down from the prior year a bit, but it's right in line with those. But it's mostly a conscientious effort of trying to cut back. We do also have a separate capital fund now for the downtown parking, and so a lot of those capital type expenditures are accounted separately in that other fund.
Okay, thank you.
No further questions. And you can continue to the staff recommendation.
Okay. I wanted to just briefly talk about a couple of proposed adjustments. I mentioned one of those. In the general fund, we're requesting additional appropriations for the finance department of $75,000 to cover UUT audit services of $50,000 and $25,000 for cable franchise audits. Over our experiences that we were going to cut these out of the budget, and it was felt, after reevaluating these items, it was felt that the benefit that we received from the audit services outweighs the expense to conduct to have these services performed on our behalf. And so we're requesting that that we receive additional appropriations for those, and that we will pay for those with the additional late fee revenue that we've been receiving in the utility operations. The other request that we have is an interesting one. It's from the county library fund. This has absolutely nothing to do with general fund. The county library fund, as you know, we operate libraries throughout Santa Barbara County: Solvang, Carpinteria, Montecito, various Goleta, and the city of Goleta and Santa Barbara County decided to do a voter survey this last year to determine whether it was feasible to have a parcel tax to help fund the operations at the Goleta Library. And the city, the portion that the county library fund that we operate has been assessed for that survey is $25,000. So we're requesting additional $25,000 of appropriation specifically for that project, and these will be paid out of county library reserves. The interesting thing about this is we believe that the expenses for the year are going to come in under budget, and so that excess will roll back down to the county library reserves at the end of the year. But we've been requested by the city of Goleta and County of Santa Barbara to have a separate appropriation request for this item. And those are the only things that we have to propose at this point in time. So are there any questions about those items?
Any questions? Can I get a motion?
I'll move the recommendation.
Is there a second?
No.
No, you're not seconding it, so I'll second it. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
No.
Mr. Samario, next item.
Okay, so we're on to item 4. This relates to the current year balancing, and you may recall that a couple months ago, or maybe 6 weeks ago, we were here before the Finance Committee and Council recommending some measures to help close the budget gap that we were projecting this year. As you know, as Rudy, in fact, has indicated, we have some revenue shortfalls this year. We have a number of measures that we've already implemented, such as capitalizing on vacant positions. But as we saw between December and February, we had additional deterioration of revenues, and we were looking for other options, and we did come before this group and the council to propose those, and we think that those options will probably come close to balancing the fund at the end of the year. At that time, we presented a couple of other options that we weren't necessarily recommending, but we wanted to bring to your attention. And one of those was related to the use of the RDA to fund the capital program in the downtown parking fund in an amount that equals what the city is currently paying for half of the maintenance of State Street sidewalks paid to the downtown organization. So it's sort of a swap of monies. RDA monies into the downtown parking fund their capital, which will free up money for them to pay the second half or the other half of that maintenance contract with the DO. And you had asked us to come back to you after going to the Downtown Parking Committee and broaching that subject with them and getting their comments and feedback, which we did. And then the other item was you had asked us to come back to evaluate the possibility of having the solid waste fund repay the general fund for the franchise fees that had been collected since 2003 up until 2009. One of the measures we implemented this year was having the franchise fees that were collected this year in the solid waste fund go to the general fund. That was $440,000. But the question you had asked us is, well, what about the previous year's, franchise fees? Shouldn't that be repaid to the general fund? And so you asked us to look at that, and is it possible? What payment strategy could we implement? And the total amount that was collected in the solid waste fund back then, and over that 6 to 7 year period, was about $2.6 million. So a lot of money, and I think we talked about the fact that initially when the program was developed, the environmental services programs and recycling programs, we really didn't have a lot of funding sources, so the franchise fees were used to fund those programs, and just over time we never changed that, and so those have been funding those programs and all that. So we wanted to talk about those two things. So starting with the easier, I think, of the two, and that is the swapping of RDA monies for capital. When we presented it to the Downtown Parking Committee, they understood that it was a cost-neutral measure, that this year there would be no impact to them because they would be, RDA would be funding their capital of about $300,000, and they can take those same dollars and pay for the other half of the maintenance of State Street sidewalks. Their concerns, as you can imagine, were that what will be is this going to be sort of open the door for a permanent shift of the full cost of that maintenance contract to the Downtown Parking Fund and the impacts that it will have on their operations. And just the fact that, the RDA is funding these items already. There's other items that the RDA is paying for currently, about $115,000 that the RDA is currently funding on an ongoing basis. That was part of the mitigation for shifting the original $312,000 for the maintenance of State Street sidewalks. And they're concerned when the RDA expires in 5 years or so, how are we going to deal with that? So, again, that was their overall concern. And so I just bring that back to you, and if you have any additional comments or questions about that, we can talk about that. And we have, I know, Christine Anderson here, Public Works Director, to respond to questions as well as myself.
Any questions from the committee? Mr. Francisco.
Mr. Samario, I didn't watch the Downtown Parking Committee hearing on this. So was there a consensus that they were okay with this transfer of funds? Or were they saying no?
Well, there wasn't a consensus.
This time.
Yeah, this time, again, they recognized that there wasn't an impact, and I don't think there was any real problem with doing it this year as long as it was a one-time measure. Their concern was that what does this mean on an ongoing basis if this were going to become a permanent shift where they're having to absorb the full cost of the contract. And it's their opinion that the initial allocation of 50% of that contract, that they didn't see much of a nexus, and so to have them pay for the full amount didn't seem to make sense to them. They didn't see any nexus or logic to that. But that was their concern because they recognized that general funds having some difficulties, and they just wanted to express those concerns.
How much RDA funds are we giving downtown parking this year? I seem to remember it was about $2.6 million.
Councilmember Williams, as far as funding for capital projects,
Yes.
Back about a month ago,
Or total funding.
for fiscal year 2011, the board conceptually approved $2,250,000 for parking lot improvements at parking structures number 10 and number 9, as well as in the current fiscal year, $192,000 to help, I believe, partially with capital projects, kind of the same setup that we're discussing today, $192,000 for fiscal year 2010.
So about 2.435 million.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Well, that sounds like a pretty good deal to me. I'd sure love to exchange $612,000 for 2.35 million any day of the week. Mr. Samario.
If I could, obviously recognize the at least the direction to look at what will be the ongoing impacts or benefits. And I know that Christine Anderson has some information, some data, really a multi-year forecast that shows, the question is how would the Downtown Parking Fund absorb the additional $312,000 in costs, because it's an operating cost. So I know she has information on that. They can look forward for the next 5 or 7 years to see how is it doing now, what's the projections, what's their capital program look like over that same period, and then again, how would this impact them? If you wanted to look at that, we brought that for your information.
Well, I think it's something that we're going to have to look at year to year. But this is, this is sort of the. I think the council is committed to taking care of both the ongoing health of the general fund and the capital needs of the downtown parking, and it'll take really a balance year to year to figure out what needs to be done when.
Right.
Any other comments from council members?
I share the Downtown Parking Committee's concern about being saddled with these maintenance costs permanently. I don't see it as central to their mission, but I also see the situation we're in this year. And so for that reason, I'm okay with it this year, but I'm worried about the long run.
Okay.
I have a question.
Councilmember Self?
Thank you, Chair. Can there be a stipulation that it be for this year only, and that it has to come before council if it's done again?
Councilmember Williams and members of the committee, that would be up to you to make that direction to staff. Certainly, we want to look at it just for this year and then come back and with an analysis of what would be the impacts on a long-term basis. Sure, we can come back with that. It's really up to the committee to recommend to the council.
Then, we're not allowed to constrain future councils, but we can just make the decision for this 1 year.
That's why I said it would have to come back before council again before we did it to them again.
Can I get Can I get a motion for a recommendation?
Thank you. I recommend the recommendation from staff with the addition that it, before maintenance costs for the sidewalk are done again, that it come before council.
We may want to
Does that
clarify
make
that
sense?
because it wasn't originally a staff recommendation. It was really originally our recommendations.
Okay.
Just to make the motion clear, the motion would be to shift the DO contract to downtown parking for 1 year only. I'll just make that as a motion.
I second it.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Let's
Okay.
talk about the solid waste
waste.
payback.
Apologize for the detail here, but just before I get into the numbers, I wanted to just to remind the committee members that in this year, as I just mentioned a little while ago, the Finance Committee and Council did approve staff's recommendation to take the $440,000 that we're expecting this year in franchise fees and shift that from the solid waste fund into the general fund. And you will see that reflected in the projected 2010 column, which shows no franchise fee revenues. And so, of course, then that would be an ongoing impact. And so the whole purpose of showing you this multi-year forecast is to be able to show you what is the solid waste fund's ability to finance or fund any kind of repayment to the general fund of the $2.6 million that it received in franchise fees over a period between 2003 and 2009. And I just again want to remind you that not only the $440,000 was lost this year and into the future, beginning next year in 2011, you'll see the fourth line, which is the recycling revenues that we get for our mixed recyclables that are collected in carts and cans. This year, we're going to receive $871,649. That's a fixed number because that is determined or calculated based on 2-year-old data. So the results of 2008 indicate that we will be getting, as a result of those results, we are getting $871,000 this year. But next year, we're not going to get any of that because of the just dramatic decline in the commodity values of those recyclables. In fact, we're going to pay this year $37,000 to the county as our share for the processing of those. We don't think it's a good idea to stop that. We just have to kind of deal with this anomaly, these unusual circumstances. But as you can see, starting in 2012, we are expected that those are going to turn around. That $400,000 that we have in 2012 in recycling revenues is based on the average of the revenues, of recyclables revenues that we've seen in this current fiscal year, because in 2012 it'll be based on 2010 results. Remember, 2-year-old data. So we can feel pretty confident that in 2012 we'll get $400,000, and then it'll start to increase beyond that in the next following years. I just made up a number of 50,000 or 150,000 in 2013, and then added a little bit in out years. So, it's good news in that it's going to be kind of a one-year sort of anomaly, and we'll start to return to normalcy start in 2012. By 2015, we could be back up to $800,000, $900,000. This is just a projection. But the $400,000 in 2012 is a pretty good number. So anyway, I want to just direct your attention to the bottom line. You can see that the net operating gain or loss this year, we're expecting about $150,000 use of reserves or a loss. You can see what our reserve balances are at the beginning of 2010. They were $1.7 million. And you may recall, we talked about the fact that we had accumulated those funds specific for a project that we're planning for next year, and that's the gas extraction system at Ewings Park. We had no idea how much that would cost. We were thinking it could be $1 to $1.5 million, so we had accumulated reserves for that purpose. So by the end of this year, we're expecting with a net loss of $152,000, we'll be down to about 1.6. For next year, because of the loss of the franchise fees and because of the fact that our recycling revenues have gone down, we are expecting to use reserves next year by almost $600,000. We were able to avoid a bigger use of reserves because we reduced costs substantially. You can see that on the special projects, which is the sixth line on the expenditure side, we went from $535,000 down to $94,000. That was how we offset some of those revenue losses. But again, almost $600,000 use of reserves next year, and so we are expected to be down to $327,000 in reserves after factoring in the cost of the Ewings Park gas extraction system of $700,000. It's possible we would get a grant from the state to reimburse us for half of that cost. We're not going to plan for that because it seems pretty unlikely, but it is possible. But by the end of next year, we're down to $327,000 in reserves. Once our revenues kick back up, or particularly the recycling revenues, we're more balanced. We're still in the red a little bit going out, but we'd be down again to a small amount of small amount of reserves. So this sort of indicates to me, at least, that our ability to repay the general fund in the near future is pretty limited. If we added, for example, $100,000 or $200,000 each year, that would just add to that bottom line. We would be consuming reserves by that amount. I mean, essentially, we're balanced in 2012, so any additional costs we would have for repayment or anything else would just go to consume those few remaining reserves. Clearly, we have the option of raising fees. You can see on the top we have our primary fees are the regional program fee. That's the amount that's really a pass-through. It's for for regional programs, the biggest of which is the Hazmat Center that's out of UCSB. That's our share of the cost. The primary portion that funds our programs is that recycling program fee of 4%. It's about $600,000 to $700,000. That's primarily what funds our programs. The big dollars that are coming in, the hauler collection services, that's basically what we pay to the haulers. That's what we collect on their behalf for the disposal and collection of our refuse in the city. That's for both haulers. So we could raise those fees. We can raise that recycling program fee. It's currently 4%. We can pick up another 1% to 2%. 1% would get us about $175,000. 1.5% would provide us a couple $100,000 that would allow us to repay the debt service if we wanted to establish that as a repayment amount. So our options are really to wait and see, perhaps, to see if recycling revenues come in stronger than what we think, and use those additional revenues to repay the general fund, or plan starting in 2012 for a rate increase to come up with sufficient dollars to fund any debt service that the committee and council recommend. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions from the committee members?
I have a question.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you. Mr. Samario, I would think that in the long run, I mean, part of the reason, if you look at your personnel costs here, part of the reason we have staff at the level that we have it is because a lot of new programs have been under development, like food scrap, recycling, conversion technologies. That's still happening. At some point, wouldn't we expect to need fewer people in this operation once those programs are underway?
Chairman Williams, committee members, Mr. Francisco, that's a good question, and we have not factored in any of that in these projections. The only thing we projected is really a small increase in salary and benefit costs, just because of what's going on currently. It is true that at some point we will get to maintenance mode. We won't be developing new programs. What we have on the horizon over the next few 2 to 3 years would be rate studies in the residential sectors. That's the single family and multi-unit. So establishing additional incentives like we did in the business sector to recycle more, to get them to a higher level, and implementing those rates, and then implementing food scraps potentially in those sectors as well. So there's plenty to do in the next couple of years. It's hard for me to say beyond that what are the things we might be doing. I don't know that we're going to see any big initiatives. If CT doesn't materialize, if we don't end up using a CT, that just means that we're going to probably have more opportunity to capture more of those recyclables in our waste stream, because we're at 70%. We can realistically get to 85%. But at some point, you're right. I just didn't factor that in. I think from between now and 2015, I don't see much of that going on. But certainly after 2015, that's a probability.
Councilmember Self.
Thank you, Chair Williams. How many people are in environmental services?
Committee Member Self, there are currently 10 staff people in that division.
Okay. And I have a comment about the solid waste repaying the $2.6 million from franchise fees.
Please.
It sounds like in the wisdom of the city, because they didn't have the money for environmental services, that they allowed them to have that money. And to me, it doesn't seem fair to reclaim it all now, that we can stop it because they're more solid now. No pun intended. Seems fair, but it's just like we have determined through our insurance rates that we have taken some of the funds from our workers' comp and put it into the general fund. And all of these water, solid waste, they all have paid a portion of that. So are we going to look at giving them back their overpayment for insurance to us? It gets so complex. I think if we're going to stop it now, that makes sense. But we could go through this with a fine comb and find out where maybe the city has been overcharging these enterprises. And should they rightfully get that back?
Well, I would have a small response to that. We have, in the past 5 and 6 years, delved into which money goes where between enterprise funds and the general fund, and many examples. And we've actually found much more often where there was outstanding subsidies that go back sometimes 20, 30 years from the general fund to those enterprise funds. We've discontinued just about all of that, and I'm not really sure that there's a whole lot of that still out there. But I do not think that there has ever been a policy decision made that we would continue a franchise fee going into an enterprise fund. And I question whether they couldn't pay anything back, and I question whether this is a 5-year time forecast, whether by the 4th or 5th year we'd still really need 10 staff in the division, and so I would question and wonder if we could have at least small payments per year back to the general fund. I'm not talking about in the 6 figures, but at least in the mid 5 figures, in order to, help stabilize this general fund, but also encourage the environmental services to to make the long-term changes, to continue while we're in this ramp-up mode, but to eventually go back down to a maintenance mode. Mr. Francisco, do you have any feelings on the subject?
Well, that's exactly why I brought that question up. I think that I do think that we will get to a maintenance level where we simply don't need that size staff, and I don't know when that will happen, but I'm assuming that it will start happening sometime. That we'll see a reduced need for staff sometime during the years up there, and obviously, I mean, there's two things we can do with that money. We can either reduce rates to ratepayers, or we can pay back some of the franchise fees to the general fund. And I think that, I mean, maybe we do both, but I agree that some money should come back, that those franchise fees that technically should have gone to the general fund, I think that was an investment, you could say, that the city made in getting these things rolling. But to the extent that we could pay some of that back, I would like to see it happen.
So my recommendation, at least for the time being, is to do something with that. I mean, you know, $100,000 payment it would take us, 20 years to pay it back. A $50,000 payment would take 40 years to pay us back. I don't know. What's that? 52 years. So, man, this is why you're finance director. But, yeah, but I don't know. Maybe we put it at 50 and recommend it to go up in outgoing years, or 75 and recommend it to go up in outgoing years. But I don't know if other committee members have a preference on the amount. But I think we should pay a little bit back, not enough to trigger an increase in rates, which I think is your concern, Councilmember Self, and my concern as well. I don't want us to trigger an increase in rates by doing this, and that's why I think it's important to make it a modest transfer.
If I could, I think you're right that there's more upside potential for us starting in 2012-13 for us to make more of a payment than perhaps what's indicated here. I was mostly trying to indicate that this year, next year, and we're going to be having to use reserves. Our ability to repay any amount starting in 2012 will really depend on how well our recycling revenues do started in that year. They could come in at $600,000, and so for next year we're going to obviously be using a lot of reserves. We can budget some of the repayment. I think as we look out 2012, we can reevaluate, and I just think there's going to be more opportunity to repay starting in 2012 than whatever you establish as a minimum in 11.
So my recommendation would be to do $50,000 for the next 2 years, and then have that rise to $100,000 in the outgoing years as a recommendation. Obviously, the councils at that time will have to make the final decision, but that being our recommendation. Yeah. Starting in the last 2 years on this. So for this next fiscal year and 2012, just do $50,000, and then the outgoing years beyond that do up it to $100,000. Does that meet your interest?
Sounds reasonable.
Can I get a motion?
Why don't you move what you just moved?
Good. I'll move that we repay from the solid waste fund to the general fund $50,000 a year for the next 2 fiscal years, with the recommendation standing to up that to $100,000 in further years.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Mr. Samario,
great.
we got
So
a couple more going.
We're down to our last item, which is the potential last item. We're looking at we're still kind of talking about the 2011 recommended budget. And one of the items we thought we wanted to bring to you was a sort of a review of our reserve policies and what our reserve balances are in the general fund and enterprise funds. And actually, this stems from the fact that I think it's been a year or maybe more than that, the Finance Committee had asked staff to bring back to them for consideration what our reserves are, but what are our reserve policies, and see, should we revisit those? Should we potentially change them? Should we put caps on them? But they had asked us to come back just to discuss that our reserve policies, see if there's any interest in changing them. But I wanted just to start with kind of a review of what we currently have per our adopted resolution 95-157, which was adopted in 1995. And essentially created 3 reserve pots, and I'll just go over them really quickly. The first is for a reserve for disasters or emergencies. That's 15% of the operating budget. And with these first 2, you'll notice that it is a function of the expenditures or operating budget, so it will change over time depending on what direction the budget goes. And obviously in the last 10 years or so, the budget has grown, so those reserve requirements have gone up. So it's important to note that there's no sort of fixed dollar amount. There's no cap on it currently. It'll just grow commensurate with the growth in our budget over time. And in the last year or 2, we've seen it actually decline because our budget has actually gone down. So it's really designed to cover lost revenues and extraordinary costs during a major disaster, whether it be an earthquake or a flood. Our impacts to revenues would be immediate. People will stop coming into town or shopping, or tourism will slow down or stop. So depending on the magnitude of the event, but we're going to be seeing loss of revenues. Plus, we'll see extraordinary costs in responding to those emergencies. Obviously, we'll get those back from the state or the federal government, FEMA, OES. We don't always get them all back, but we get a good portion of those back. But that's really what it's designed to cover. And I think at some point, when you look at that reserve plus the 10% of the second one I'll talk about in a moment, that 25% reserve was designed to provide us with basically 3 months worth of operating costs. So if you think about 25% of a 12-month period, that's 3 months. So it's supposed to cover 3 months of lost revenues and or extraordinary costs. And that's kind of how it was designed. They just split it into 2 pots, the second being a reserve for future years' budgets. And that is the portion that is designed to help the city during periods of declining revenues, as we've seen. We saw in the early 90s, we saw in 2001 and 2, and then we're seeing now. And so it's designed it's sort of to, we know that the economy goes in cycles, and sometimes we'll see big declines, and those reserves would help offset, so we're not having to cut services dramatically. We can just sort of ride the wave until things turn around. And then we have a reserve for capital. And the general fund, it's a fixed amount, $1 million. And there's been a lot of talk about why do we have that? Is it really valuable? It is kind of an unusual reserve to have for capital since we've never used it. It was intentionally designed to cover any cost overruns in our capital program for the general fund. Again, never been used. But personally, I see that as really just being part of the budgetary reserve, the 10%. We can almost count it as part of that. I know there's been some discussion of why not we just eliminate it. If we wouldn't eliminate the dollars, we would just merge it in with the reserve for future year's budget. In the enterprise funds, though, that capital reserve is much different because they are much more capital intensive in what they do. And so that is not a fixed amount. It's actually a percentage. It's calculated one of 2 ways, as a percentage of their net book value. So when you look at all their assets, their fixed assets, and subtract their accumulated depreciation, we take 5% of that. Or we look at the last 5 years of their capital program, and that's what we established on that average, the reserve. So it's usually a bigger dollar amount. Oftentimes in some of these enterprise funds, we see their capital reserve exceeding their other reserves for emergencies and the like. And the other thing that's indicated in the resolution that was adopted in 1995 is that all use of reserves, as you know, it does require council approval, and that the use of reserves should be accompanied by a plan for the replenishment within a reasonable period of time. One of the things that I did was I sent out a survey request, and we have a listserv, which is a California Society of Municipal Finance Officers, and these go out every few years. People do these. You don't typically get a lot of response, and so you're not sure whether the responses are representative of what's really out there. This basically asked the question, what reserve policies do you have for your general fund? And I got responses from about 15 cities and a few special districts. And you can see that we kind of categorize them into what our budgetary reserves, which are more for what we call our future years reserves, the economic uncertainty, and then some people actually have a specific reserve just for emergencies. So we have up to 3 different categories, and then there's a capital reserve, which is only the city of Mountain View actually has a capital reserve, which is a fixed amount. But you can see the percentages that just vary from city to city. Some cities don't have any. Some cities have up to 100%. You can see the city of La Habra Heights has 100% of their operating budget in the reserve. I haven't really analyzed to see how big is the city, what's the type of city, is it a bedroom community, is it a tourism-based community? I think there are a lot of factors going into personally what should our reserve policies be. I've always felt that 25% is a reasonable number. Some could argue should be more, and then some argue why do you have so much? I think the fact that we are not a bedroom community, but we do rely on tourism, and our revenues are much more volatile than, for example, the city of Camarillo. I would say that the city of Santa Barbara should have a higher level of reserves, whether it's a fixed amount or a percentage, than the city of Camarillo, because they don't have volatility in their revenues. We have dramatic volatility, so I think that degree of volatility should have some bearing, at least, on what a reserve requirement you should have. And just recently, of course, we saw dramatic declines in sales taxes, bed taxes, and the like. If it wasn't for the fact that we had reserves, we wouldn't be able to respond to any of those things. And so they have helped us in the past. So that's one fact you would look at. Again, I'm not sure if this is really helpful. This just kind of gives you a sense of those cities that responded in special districts, what they have in reserve policies. I just offered this for conversation or discussion to see if there's any need or desire to talk about what our reserve policies are. But I just wanted to offer at least the survey results and my personal thoughts on what reserve policies should be, at least what should be considered in determining what they are. And then we can go back to this. I just want to really quickly show you what our reserve balances are.
Hold on, before you move on. Any other questions from council members on this slide? Because I do want to try to, in the long run, compare to comparable budgets and comparable cities. And these guys are all over the map, and they're also all over the map in terms of population and size of budgets,
right,
and how sales tax dependent they are. I mean, some of these cities are far more sales tax dependent than we are, which is why they should and would have larger reserves too. So, I think it would be important if we could, in the long run, to be looking at, substantially similar cities. Ventura is a substantially similar city, but I'm sure you can find a lot of other examples.
Santa Monica,
right? For us to be looking at, and maybe they won't answer emails, but we'll figure out another way to get their information.
So we don't need to spend a lot of time on this. I just wanted to show you what our reserve balances were as of June 30, 2009. I've shown here only the general fund and our enterprise funds. What's not shown here are what we call our special revenue funds. For example, our Creeks fund is not shown here. Our solid waste fund is really listed as a special revenue fund. We reclassified it to this coming year as an enterprise fund. But there are a lot of funds that aren't shown here that have reserves. Again, like the Creeks fund has a capital fund, and there's some reserves in there. So the magnitude of our reserves is a lot bigger than this. These are just the primary funds that have reserve policies. So the reserve policies that I just went over don't apply to any other fund other than these 8 funds or 7 funds. So you can see that in the general fund, our disaster reserves are 15%, a function of our operating budget, $15.5 million. Our future year's budget reserve of 10% should be somewhere around $10 million. As of June 30, 2009, they were $1.2 million, and we've talked about that before. We're about $9 million short there in funding that policy reserve. Our capital reserve, $1 million fixed. And just going to the enterprise funds, you can see the same calculations, but as I kind of alluded to before, the water fund has a capital reserve of almost $5.2 million. Almost, just under the combined amounts of their disaster and future years budget reserves. They also have a reserve of $2.9 million. That was for the reactivation of the desal plant. That was set up a number of years ago when we sold portions of what they call the trains, or we sold them to Saudi Arabia, and we got some revenue from that. And so those revenues were established as a reserve. The reactivation cost will be a lot more than that, but then we put aside those proceeds in a reserve. So you can see in total as of June 30, 2009, and it's important to note this is June 30, 2009. We have this current year activity and then what we're budgeting next year, but you can see they have a total of $14.7 million in reserves. They have only 44,877 reserves above policy, so they're right on the line, and that's consistent with the conversation you've been hearing about the fact that they are going to have to look at long term what the rates are to cover particularly their capital program. In this year, they're budgeting the use of reserves of $2.8 million, and they're actually budgeting the use of a portion of their capital reserves. In the wastewater fund, you can see the same calculations. I don't have to get into detail, but we do show what they're budgeting to use this year. And in most cases, it's the use of those reserves above policy that they would be budgeting. Downtown Parking Fund, we were just talking about that. They do have, as of June 30, or did have, $3.1 million in reserves above policy, so a fairly healthy reserve, but you can see that they're planning this year to use about $1.3 million of those reserves above policy. In talking to staff, they're expecting that may be less because they have costs that are savings that they're going to realize that'll lower that use. But essentially, their operating budget is balanced. Their revenues match their expenses, and so they're currently going to have to be using over the next few years, unless they raise revenues, those reserves above policy to fund their capital program, which totals between $300,000 and $600,000 per year. So in spite of the fact that the RDA is paying for these large projects, the more maintenance types of capital that they are involved with are currently going to be funded from the reserves above policy, again, until they can find a way to recover, or whether raising parking rates or some other way to fund the ongoing capital program that relates primarily to the maintenance of the structures. Airport fund, they do have reserves of a policy, but have no planned use of them this year. Golf course, you can see that they are actually into their policy reserves by $335,000, and that was as of last year. They did borrow some money from the general fund, as you know, this year. That was to avoid using any more of those reserves. And they will be using more reserves this year, as you've heard. They are reducing costs, but they're going to probably have another 100 or so use of reserves this year based on the fact that the rounds and the play and the revenues are down. And you can see waterfront fund. So again, just wanted to go over these. What's the picture between now and 2011? At the end of next year, it'll be probably dramatically different in some cases. In some cases, it'll be pretty static. But this is, we calculate these reserves at the end of each year. So last year was the last full year we've completed. These are audited numbers, and sometime in August or September we'll have the final numbers for June 30, 2010. So just wanted to at least present these to you, and then just be happy to answer any questions. Or
Is there any questions from the committee? Councilmember Self.
Thank you, Chair Williams. Bob, I have a question. You were mentioning that in order to spend down the reserves, that council had to make a reasonable agreement to repay within a reasonable time. Was that agreement made, and what was it?
I think that there was, we look at these, Councilmember Self or Committee Member Self, we do, present to the City Council multi-year forecasts, and so we recognize that with structural changes to the budget, cuts and raising revenues in other areas, that eventually we will come back. So I'm not sure that there is a formal plan. In fact, I know there's no formal plan, but I think the expectation is that as we cut back on our costs, as we shrink the size of the general fund budget, that with the natural growth that we typically would see in our revenues, we would be back to restoring those reserves. It's just this case is going to take a little longer than we would typically expect.
Okay, so it doesn't mean that there does have to be an agreement to pay. They can just spend it.
Yeah, I don't think it has to be, it doesn't suggest a formal plan, but just some at least plan that we would repay those reserves. And I think that is the expectation.
Thank you.
Chair Williams and members of the committee, I'd like to give you a couple thoughts on this, and just in terms of, possibly a plan. One, in terms of the capital reserve, if we never have a plan to use it, it almost doesn't make sense in the general fund to have it. And to me, at some point, my recommendation would be part of the budget reserve. More importantly, I think we do need to start thinking about how do we pay back the budget reserves. And the thought I have had is that one of the things that we've done in terms of slicing this thing really tight is we initiated that variance in the revenues. Basically, we were doing better than expected for years, and so we created that variance and basically we said, oh, we always do better than budget, so let's budget some of that in, and I think that worked, but we probably overdid it. And one of the thoughts I've had is that possibly by fiscal year 12, I don't think we can do it next year, that we eliminate budgeting for the variance, and that we take, and then I would expect every year we will end up with a surplus in the general fund, unless revenues, do what they did this year. I mean, typically we underexpend by 1 or 2%. And then my recommendation would be that we then take half of that surplus and it goes to repay the budgetary reserves, and the other half go into a fund for capital. And then it deals with this infrastructure problem we also have because we've been underfunding our general fund capital. And it'd be a policy that we say, okay, if we end up $3 million to the good, $1.5 million goes back into repaying that general fund budget reserve, and the other half goes in to be allocated out by the council for capital. And then the other part of it would probably be, and if you ever got into the disaster reserve, that any surplus goes to repay the disaster reserve. Nothing goes into capital reserve. But that's kind of my thought about it. Again, I don't think we're in a position next fiscal year to do it, although we've cranked down that budget variance down. I think we're budgeting $1.3 million next year, Bob. Mm-hmm. So it's like, 1.25%. But I think next year, fiscal year 12, we'll probably be in the position to do something like that. So that's kind of the thoughts I've had. And just in terms of what other cities do, I've been in this business a long time, and asking cities what their reserves are, we're probably much more transparent about those kinds of issues than a lot of cities. And when you do these listserv requests and say, what are your reserves, you get a lot of stuff that's difficult to look at. And if you really were going to do it, you almost need to have somebody like a Bob or Rudy go and look at the city's CAFR and their budget and try and figure out what their reserves are. Even in our situation, I actually think we estimate our general fund reserves, because a few years ago when we set this policy up, for example, we had a $4 million deficit in our workers' comp fund. We were underwater $4 million there, and now we're to the good. We had no vehicle reserves, and now we have, the general fund portion of the vehicle reserves is probably $1.5 million or so. And we didn't have a lot of facility reserves for replacement, so you could actually, compared to where we were when you set this reserve, we're probably in better shape than this makes us look like. But those are just some thoughts I've had about it.
Any other questions? I also agree that I've watched for 7 years this sort of capital reserve. It's $1 million. It's always untouched. Always just stays there. To me, if it's for capital, we should either use it or we should put it in. And if it's not for capital and it's really part of the budgetary reserves, then we should be putting it in the budgetary reserves. And so, to me, we should be doing one or the other. And I'm happy with either. And no time like the present. If the Finance Committee is ready to make a recommendation on that. Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree that we shouldn't just have $1 million that sits there and has no purpose. So coming up with a better definition for that is a good idea. Another thing that I would like to see that I think would be helpful to council is a policy that gives us guidelines on the use of and the replenishment of reserves. I don't think it's realistic to replenish reserves when revenues are going down. And I think it would be helpful, I don't know if other cities have policies like this, to say that there is some band in which you don't touch the reserves, and when revenue goes above that band, you're in replenishment mode. When it goes below that band, then it's, generally speaking, a good idea to use the reserves to backfill that.
I think that'd be a great idea. I mean, our policies do talk more generally. They don't get into those kind of specific details as to what dollar amount or percentage can you not fall below, or, what you just sort of went through. We can look at what other cities have. We can start asking for the reserve policy documents from other cities across the state, see what kind of response we get in another survey. But we can craft whatever the committee and council wants us to in terms of more specific policies to add to what we currently have.
I mean, I think it's always going to be up to the council to decide, but I think having guidelines like that would be helpful for people.
Sure, we can bring you some thoughts, some ideas, what other cities are doing.
You know, I'm not sure that if Mr. Armstrong is correct that that's not maybe as valuable as simply making a benchmark. You know, you could benchmark at CPI, and you could say if our revenues exceed several percent of that CPI, then that should be replenishment mode. And if they fall below a certain percent of that CPI, use some of our reserves to create the continuity of public services. And I think that might make sense as just making some determination based on our past histories of ups and downs of revenue of what makes the most sense to create that band. I think that's an excellent idea, and I think that we do need to be committed to returning our reserves into a more healthy level. Not sure how much that can be accomplished when we're having the floor taken out from under us in revenues, but we do need to be planning that for the long term. Councilmember Self.
Thank you, Chair Williams. I guess in these guidelines and for council, I would like to see a little something more stringent than just a guideline, because our revenues were spent when we had pretty healthy revenues. And so, like kids finding somebody else's pocketbook, it got spent with, I don't think, much to show for it. And so I don't know if that would be an ordinance to put stricter guidelines, because now when we could use those revenues, because we are in revenue shortfall, we don't have it to fall back on. And I think that was the intent.
Well, I think the case is that we can't bind future councils, so even if we can't create more than guidelines, because we cannot bind future councils to our decisions about the budget for when the years that we will not be in office. So I think a guideline is a good way to signal future councils what the responsible thing to do is, but we're just not allowed to by law to constrain their actions. If the voters elect people who are not going to be smart about spending their reserves, then that's what's going to happen. But we could at least make it clear what we think is the responsible and right way to be governing our finances.
Yeah, I would hope that it would say that reserves are recommended for these purposes only, and maybe a little history lesson of where we are now and why this is important. You sure we can't tie him up somewhere? Thank you.
I think it's been tried. Well, if we wish, we could make a recommendation on both the reserve policies or deeper examination of reserve policies and the what to do with capital reserve, and ask Mr. Samario to agendize that on a future meeting if that's what is desired by the committee.
Is that your motion?
That's what I'm hearing. I'll make the motion and the request. Well, I think we can just make the request, since it's not an action item, make the request that we'd like to have a deeper examination and make some amendments to the reserve policies, to examine both what to do with capital reserve and to provide some sort of guidance for both our current council and future councils as to what's the proper times to be spending reserves and proper times to be adding to reserves.
Okay, sounds good.
Great. Thank you. With that, I think we'll, do you have one more item?
Yeah, it's 12:30. We have time to go through the items that we were planning to go over tomorrow, and therefore we wouldn't have to meet tomorrow.
Great.
And there are two items related to that. The first is a look at staff recommended adjustments. It's kind of an unusual name because it's not like we're saying, well, let's change the numbers just arbitrarily. What happens typically, and this happens every year, really, is between the time of filing the budget in April and adopting the budget, there are changes in circumstances or new information. Sometimes it's just correcting mistakes that are in the budget that we bring before the Finance Committee and then Council. And these are to adjust the budget that's currently filed before we get to the adoption. And so we wanted to go over just a few adjustments. They're not really major, just they're, some of them are technical, but we wanted to at least go over them for your review.
Please, Mr. Samara. And one question about that reserve slide is the way to wouldn't the way to calculate what our current reserves would be to subtract that right column from the total policy reserves column?
Chairman Williams,
Or
members
the total
members of the
policy.
committee, that's part of it. So when you look at the reserves above
At
policy,
least you get an approximate amount.
what is budgeted this year for the use reserves, and again, it's essentially for capital. Can lower the amounts in those columns before it by those budgeted use reserves. It will be impacted, however, by a number of things. One, what do the revenues in that fund do, and what do the expenditures in that fund do? They could be, there's always year-end variances, so we could end up the year with an operating gain or operating loss. Because we always budget essentially a balanced operating budget, so it'll be impacted by that. Sometimes they don't use all the reserves. Sometimes the costs come in lower than what they expected. Sometimes they go in higher and they have to make supplemental preparations. So that's just one factor, but that is true in terms of you would back that up as a starting point.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Samara.
So we'll start with some adjustments that are in the general fund first, and just to kind of orientate you to the way this is organized, you can see that we have three columns. First is any adjustments that we're proposing to estimated revenues or budgeted revenues, and a positive number is an increase, a negative number is a decrease. And then what the appropriations adjustment we're recommending, a positive is an increase in appropriations, and the negative is reduction. And then if there is any net impact of that, that's reflected in the last column, which is the addition or use of reserves, and that's just reflected in the very bottom. So you can see the sum of all these adjustments we're recommending have only a small use in the impact on the use reserves of $1,500. It's actually a reduction in the use of reserves. So starting with the first item, we just talked about this. That was the very first item in today's meeting. It was the increase in revenues for the pilot payment from the Housing Authority. We're estimating that to be $57,000. It'll be revenues into the general fund unrestricted. In the city administrator's office, again, this is one of those we missed it. We should not have budgeted the CalCRIP revenue in the general fund. It's budgeted in a separate grants fund. So this is really a correction of what's in the budget currently. We're reducing the revenues. Has no impact on the actual receipt of the grant. And in the fire department, actually, I see that Mr. Ron Lichty, our business manager, is there. He can speak to these, but I'll just start generally, and if we have any questions, I'm sure you can answer them. But in their proposed budget, they had included the elimination of a shift warehouse specialist, and what they're suggesting now is to swap that out. Let's put that position back in the budget, and instead eliminate a vacant office specialist too, approximately the same dollar amounts. So that they just want to swap one for the other. And they also have done additional analysis from their proposal to eliminate 2 vacant relief captain positions, and they feel that that will save an additional $30,000 than what's currently in the proposed budget. I think Mr. Armstrong had a couple comments.
Yeah, and just to be clear, in the fire department, actually, both of the 2 captain positions and also the office specialist position, they were always intending, these were vacant, they weren't intending to fill them, but they just didn't budget for that. And when they discovered it, they said, hey, we should have budgeted for this. There's actually additional savings. And so when that came out, then we said, okay, then you've got $90,000 in savings. And they said, can you basically take the warehouse specialist position that's proposed for elimination and take it and move it out of the kind of option 1 into the second list. And so that's what we did here.
And then those adjustments related to Parks and Recreation, I'm actually going to ask Jill Zachary, the Assistant Parks and Recreation Director, to speak to them.
Ms. Zachary.
There we go. I'm on. Just very briefly, in FY10, we budgeted revenue and expenditures for the work that our forestry program does to remove branches that are in front of the no parking signs for street sweeping. In FY11, the Streets Division is actually going to be doing that as part of their program. And then for the Teen Center lease, as we presented to Council as part of our budget proposal for FY11, we're proposing to have PAL operate the Teen Center and lease it from the city. We originally budgeted $15,000 in revenue for that. We're reducing that revenue amount by $7,000 in our negotiations with PAL. We've determined they would take on some other operational costs associated with the Teen Center, so we reduce the lease revenue in recognition of their additional costs. And then for the last one, the estimated revenue and appropriations, reducing it for maintenance of facilities, that's actually specific to our sports program, and it's in our miscellaneous grants fund. We budgeted revenue and expenditures in that amount related to the maintenance of restrooms when our sports facilities are rented. We charge for that maintenance fee, and then we actually, provide that service. So with the reduced cost to maintain the restrooms, we no longer will need to actually get the revenue when we rent the facilities.
Manager of the Cottage Health System,
Thank you.
and Community Outreach.
And then the last item in the general fund is in the police department. As you know, the city and the school district have recently come to an agreement whereby they will split the costs for the crossing guard program. So we are budgeting now the appropriations of $105,000, and half of those revenues coming from the school district of $52,650. So we will continue then next year the school crossing program, just sharing the cost between the city and the school district. But you can see again that essentially the net impact of the general fund is $1,500. Effectively, what we're doing is we're paying for our share of the school crossing guard program from additional revenues from the housing authority. I mean, that's essentially how it kind of works out. The next item is in our City Hall allocation fund, and this essentially serves or functions like an internal service fund. What we're proposing is, and this gets a little complicated, so I'm going to try to keep it to my level at least. There's two components to this. We've always had a need to replace, the last few years, to replace our City Hall telephone switch. It's located when you walk into the, from De La Guerra, just to the left, there's a little room in there. That's where the switch is, and it affects other departments as well and other operations. But it's been essentially due for upgrade, and we were potentially looking at maybe waiting a couple of years when monies were available. There's another component to this, and that is that we've upgraded some information systems servers, and in order for us to fully be able to utilize those, we need to upgrade one piece of hardware that's tied to the switch, and that will allow us to fully implement that new server and new system and new technology. That portion is only about $10,000 or $15,000, and so we were looking at doing that, but since we're going to be messing around with the switches, it made sense for us to why not go ahead and upgrade those switches now, since we're expecting to do the next couple of years anyway, and they were already due for replacement. So this is really two components: to upgrade the switches, but also to upgrade or add new hardware to allow us to essentially, the voicemail that we get through our computers, it's all tied related to that, where people can call in, and on your computer you can receive that voicemail, forward it if you like, and that piece of hardware we need to replace or upgrade in order for us to have more functionality with that system. We are going to be looking at in the next couple of months whether or not we just fully go to a new technology, and it's referred to as VoIP or voice over internet protocol. That will be a much larger cost, to be upwards of $200,000 or $300,000. It may be time to do that or move to that new technology, since that's kind of where the industry is going, the trends is going. But we haven't done enough analysis to know whether that makes sense. So for now, we're going to put this into the budget, but we won't spend this until we've done that analysis, see whether it makes sense to go to that new technology. And if we do decide to do that, we'll come back to council and ask for more dollars to appropriate for that full cost. And then there, in the county library fund, and I know Irene Macias is here, but essentially we are getting additional revenues. And let me back up. This relates to the Montecito Library. And as you know, the county library fund operates a number of branches. Unfortunately, their revenues haven't been able to support all their costs, and they've been using reserves in that county library fund. So not part of the general fund, but they've been using the reserves to basically close the gap between their operating revenues and costs. And staff, library staff has felt that, we can't be depleting the reserves as we have been, because we're eventually going to run out in a few years. And so what they've implemented is across the board of all those branches to close on the libraries on Mondays. That will help save those costs so that we're a little more balanced. In the Montecito Library, the county and Montecito Library folks felt that, we have some gift monies that we have, and we account for those monies. We have some gift monies, somewhere in the order of $300,000, and they had directed us staff to use those gift monies to at least keep the Montecito Library open on Mondays, and that would cost almost $19,000. So this proposal is to increase the appropriations that will allow us to keep open on Mondays for that library, and it would be funded from, we call it donation revenues, but it's really a transfer of gift monies that we have that are dedicated for the Montecito Library into the county library fund to fund those costs. And again, if you have any more questions about that, that's about as versed as I am. I know Ms. Macias is here to answer any more detailed questions.
Questions from the committee members? Mr. Francisco.
Thank you. Mr. Samario, about this phone system upgrade, exactly what is it and what is it going to do for us? And is it just City Hall or is it the whole city?
The switch, committee member Francisco, the switch is located in the City Hall, but it does impact other areas, other facilities, because they're all sort of tied together. So these switches are just old switches, and they are in need of upgrade. So that's the primary component. That's the $75,000, $80,000 or $90,000 portion of that cost. And as I said, we really haven't looked or identified any funds for those. And I know that Public Works staff didn't realize we did have some appropriations or some funds in our City Hall allocation fund that were dedicated specifically for replacing that switch. And so they were anticipating waiting a few more years and finding a way to fund that. But it has been a need. And so since we kind of need to do it anyway now because of this other component related to our Outlook Exchange server, we need to upgrade that piece. We felt that there was, economies of scale, and it made sense to do it all together. And so we were proposing to do those things now, upgrade the switch while we're there, while we're working on the system, since we're going to be, messing around with them. So again, I don't have a lot of the technological details of that, and I can get more information, but that's as far as I can tell you.
Okay.
Hopefully that helps.
Any other questions? Is there a recommendation?
Well, we have a few more. So I'm actually going to speak to the Measure A fund adjustments and then the Streets fund adjustments. They both really are just refining our revenue estimates. We have more information on what the revenues are going to be based on the results of this year, so we are proposing to tweak those revenue estimates. In the case of the Measure A fund, we're proposing that we think it's appropriate to lower the revenue estimates by $215,000. And that's going to basically have to come from a reduction in expenditures or appropriations by an equal amount so that we don't use any reserves, because there aren't any reserves in that fund. And then down below in the Streets fund, it's actually just going the other direction. We believe that we can raise revenue estimates related to the highway user tax or HUTA monies by $338,000. Those would just go toward additional appropriations for the resurfacing program. So again, no impact on reserves. It's just additional dollars for that program. In the Risk Management Fund, we have a position that we've had vacant for a few years. It was a position that was dedicated to our safety program. We eliminated the position, at least the staff person retired. we never really deleted the position because we felt like we might need it in the future. At this point, we don't think we are going to need that position. Our safety program is being handled by other staff, and it's working very well. So we're just proposing to take those dollars out of the budget, reduce the appropriations, and those then would fall to reserves to offset what we've been using over the last few years in terms of the reserves being drawn for the general fund. So it's just a technical adjustment just to take those budget dollars that we know we're not going to need out of the budget in the risk management fund. And again, long term, that's going to benefit the general fund and enterprise funds in terms of what costs we're charging them. So that represents all the staff recommended adjustments. Any questions?
Questions from the committee? Mr. Francisco.
Mr. Samario, who would I talk to about the phone switch upgrade to get more details
Sure.
on that?
Two people you would talk to, Mr. Francisco. One is Tom Doolittle, the Information Systems Manager, as well as Jim Dewey, who is our Facilities Superintendent or Manager.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Is there a recommendation for council on this item?
This is an action item. We make a motion?
This is an action item, yes.
Okay. I make the motion that we accept the budget recommendations submitted by Mr. Samario
And recommend them to council.
and recommend them to council.
Is there a second? I'll second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? One abstention. And one note, I would like to do a caveat to the sort of the Parks and Rec items that we just did. Is, I spend a lot of time and occasionally go and speak to high school classes, and one of the high school classes at San Marcos claimed that we are no longer using our recording studio in the teen center. I don't know if that's true or not, but I would love for us to make sure that in the transference and the lease to PAL that there's someone actually skilled enough to use the recording studio, because we spent an awful lot of money on that equipment. And I do not want it just to sit there until it's obsolete, especially when it could go to exciting young people about something productive. So that's just a request, because I'll let it. And I guess the other one is I am hopeful that we could do a good enough job to not make those changes to the bathrooms, because I think really when we're in the point of not having enough money to clean parks bathrooms, that's a little pitiful as a city, and I hope that we'll continue to do our due diligence on balancing the budget in the next 30 days, so that that will become not needed. Those are my comments. Any other comments on this item?
Yes.
Councilmember Sell?
Maybe we could get community service to take care of our bathrooms. But I do have another comment, and that is at one of our recent meetings, they were talking about new staff getting an automatic 5% pay increase. And I didn't know, it wasn't clear about how long that went on or whatever, but I was wondering, would it be your department who would give us a breakdown on salaries for positions and, kind of an overview of what people are getting paid? And I had read with certain departments, if you're bilingual, you get more money, and, so on and so forth.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, and myself, we can provide you all those things. We have, as you know, MOU related to all the bargaining units that indicate what their special pays might be, whether it be bilingual or other types of pay. But in terms of that 5% you're referring to, every position has what's called a salary range, and that range is a 20% range, step 1 through step 5. So depending on where people are actually hired, and typically they aren't hired at step 1, but if, for example, they're hired at step 2, then every year they're eligible for a merit increase. It's not something that's automatic. It has to be essentially earned through good performance. And if they perform according to what their expectations are and objectives and all those things, and the supervisor feels it's warranted, they will receive up to a 5% increase up to the time till they reach their maximum range. So, as somebody who's hired a step 2, they have 3 more steps to reach, and that would be accomplished over a 3-year period, essentially, if they're getting a 5% per year increase for merit. It has nothing to do with what's negotiated or what's in the labor contracts. Those, again, are per negotiated contracts. So we're talking, different things. One's a merit increase up to 5% per year, and the other ones are what's negotiated pursuant to labor contracts or negotiations. But we can certainly provide you, and we would be the department that you would look to
Okay.
help you to understand all the various pays and all that stuff.
Yes, I would appreciate that information. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, next item, Mr. Samar.
One last item, and this is really bringing back an item that was requested at the City Council meeting when the Waterfront Department presented their budget. Actually, it was discussed here, too, the proposed increase to slip transfer fees. There was a request for additional information to justify the proposed increase, although I will say that when we did present this to the City Council, I think Councilmember Hasself did indicate that now that she understood a little better, you felt like you could support it. But we're still here to at least discuss it and provide you more information and answer any questions. And Mr. John Briley, the Waterfront Director, is here to present that item.
But this is not necessarily an action item, since
This is
the
not an
council
action.
already took an action on it.
Well, we brought all these fee increases to the Finance Committee, and there was no recommendation on this item. So the recommendation to the Finance Committee, the Council, is there is none on this particular item.
Right.
So at this point, if we could, we'd like to get a recommendation from the Finance Committee if they felt comfortable that the proposed rate increases that they're going to talk about now are that you can recommend to the full Council, and we would report that to them on June 14th.
Thank you for that clarification.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, not knowing exactly what the committee wanted me to bring back, I think I've tried to nail what the questions were. And primarily there was a request for justification associated with the slip transfer fee increase of going from currently $250 per lineal foot up to $275 per lineal foot. Just a little history on the slip transfer fee. It started in 1982 as a $10 administrative fee to basically process a slip transfer from a selling boat owner to a buyer. The fee gradually increased up to $50 in 1987 and remained at $50 until 2003. 2003, we basically looked at implementing a $25 per lineal foot increase each and every year, and we've been doing that since 2003. Currently at $250, and the proposal to go to $275. I noted in the chart and in looking at our overall revenues, this is a substantial amount of funding that we get from our slip transfer fees. In 2007, we were generating about $675,000, which is about 14% of our total marina revenues of about $4.9 million. Justification overall for the slip transfer fee, to be honest, is allowing the sale of vessels from a seller to a buyer and to transfer the slip permit. Unfortunately, when one transfers that slip permit, they get an added value on the boat sale by being able to transfer that permit. Our efforts are to recapture some of that private sector value that takes place, and that's why the fee was enacted, and that's why our recommendation is to continue to increase it. We did, as I pointed out at this meeting and at the council meeting, we have suspended any further increases on the smaller slip, our smallest slip, which is 20 foot, because we do not want the slip transfer fee to be a deterrent to somebody who gets one off the wait list or who is in the process of purchasing a 20-foot boat. The chart is basically to show you on a percentage basis of, and I took the 25-foot slip because it's probably the next size up that we would be looking at suspending the increases on. Our transfer fee is, again, the history I talked about. Transfer fee total, if it were today at $250 per lineal foot, would be about $6,200. to transfer the boat and the permit. We believe the private sector value for about a 25-foot slip would be in the range of $23,000 to $24,000 added value to the boat sale. Transfer fee as a percentage of that value, our percentage, what we would get in the transfer fee, is about 26% of the private sector value. Again, I just highlighted how important the slip transfer fee revenue is to the department. And we, of course, are seeing a significant decline in that value because in this kind of market recessionary period, boats aren't necessarily selling, and therefore slips are not necessarily transferring. So if you look at 2009, 2010, we're about half. I do not think that has any relevance to the amount of the slip transfer fee, but just simply the economy, and boats are kind of secondary for folks at this point. So that would be hopefully addressing the issue, and I'd answer any questions you might have.
Any questions from the committee?
I have a question.
Mr. Francisco.
Mr. Bridley, just out of curiosity, the percentage, obviously the absolute dollars have gone down precipitously in terms of the slip transfer fee revenue, but do you know off the top of your head what the current percentage of total marina revenues is currently?
Well, I guess if I understand your question, Councilman.
It was 14-something in 2007 in a good year, and I'm just curious, have other revenues dropped off this steeply so that it's kind of in that same ballpark, or has it declined considerably?
It's declined considerably.
Okay.
Our slip fees have gone up slightly every year. Our visitor rates are been very good, and we're full most of the year. So in the marina management, this is our largest decline of any fee that we have. And again, I think it's just simply recessionary. Boats are not selling. I'm seeing the same type of decline in yacht broker percentage rent paid to the department because we get a percentage of the amount of business they do. There's some brokers suffering significantly in this market.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, that'll take care of the items, and we can adjourn. Oh, unless you're looking for a recommendation on this.
Recommend support of the proposed fee increase.
Well, I'll just say for my part that, I mean, the origin of the dysfunction is that our slip fees are so below other marinas that it creates essentially a value to the slip that's so high that people are making a private profit off of a public resource. And of course that means that for the average citizen that wants to get a slip, the barrier is very high. And so this is I view it as a long-term problem. It's sort of like the things that happen when you enact rent control, is that you get these agreements between people that they agree instead of going to the landlord and changing ownership, they're changing ownership between tenants and subleasing from one person to another. This is sort of similar to that, in my mind, in terms of market behavior as transferring a slip. I think the slip transfer fee at least is an attempt to recapture some of that public benefit, though one might argue that the only way to change that is to actually eliminate the incentive to profit from that slip transfer, so that everybody that wants to, get a slip in the city might be able to without having to, on top of paying the costs to the waterfront department, paying the costs to another private party, just so that they will let go of their slip. So this is at least a muddling through solution. And I think the best that we have at this point, and I would support the recommendation. It also enables us to not raise other things like commercial fishermen slip fees, for example. which is important part of keeping fishing going in the harbor. Is there any recommendation from the committee?
I'm okay with the recommendation to increase the slip fee.
Okay, is that a motion?
Sure.
I'll second it. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Recommendation to council.
That's everything. Thank you.